Today we have some more actual history about events surrounding the French and Indian War that took place between 1754 and 1763. This was when the French allied with Indian tribes such as the Delawares and Shawnees, and those tribes began attacking English colonists living along the western frontier, near the Allegheny Mountains. In this episode, we will read the story of the Bard family, who were captured by Delaware Indians in 1758. We will be reading from this book, Incidents of Border Life by Jospeh Pritts. This book was published all the way back in 1838. It details many of the incidents of Indian attacks and Indian captivity during the colonial period and around the time of the American Revolution. Richard Bard was an attorney, and this story was written by his son after his father had died, based on the papers he left behind documenting his family's Indian captivity. It appears that the son was not captured, but both of his parents were. The story is titled, An Account of the Captivity of Richard Bard, Esquire, late of Franklin County, Pennsylvania, with his wife, family, and others, collected from his papers by his son, Archibald Bard. Although his son only mentions his father's name in the title, as you will see, his mother suffered much worse treatment in captivity than his father. My father, Richard Bard, lived in York County, now Adams, and owned the mill now called Marshall's Mill, in what is called Carroll's Tract, where on the morning of the 13th of April, 1758, his house was invested by a party of 19 Indians. They were discovered by a little girl called Hannah McBride, who was at the door and on seeing them screamed and ran into the house. At this time there were in the house my father, mother, and Lieutenant Thomas Potter, brother of General Potter, who had come the evening before, being a full cousin, together with a child of about 6 months old, and a bound boy. The Indians rushed into the house, and one of them, with a large cutlass in his hand, made a blow at Potter, but he so managed it as to wrest the sword from the Indian, and return the blow, which would have put an end to his existence had not the point struck the ceiling, which turned the sword so as to cut the Indian's hand. In the meantime, Mr. Bard, my father, laid hold of a horseman's pistol that hung on a nail, and snapped it at the breast of one of the Indians. But there being tow in the pan, it did not go off. At this, the Indian, seeing the pistol, ran out of the house. By this time, one of the Indians at the door had shot at Potter, but the ball took him only in the little finger. The door was now shut and secured as well as possible, but finding the Indians to be very numerous and having no powder or ball, and as the Indians might easily burn down the house by reason of the thatched roof, the quantity of millwood piled at the back of the building, added to the declarations of the Indians that they would not be put to death, determined them to surrender. On which a party of the Indians went to a field and made prisoners of Samuel Hunter and Daniel McManamy. A lad of the name of William White, coming to the mill, was also made a prisoner. Having secured the prisoners, they took all the valuable effects out of the house, and set fire to the mill. They then proceeded to the mountain, and my mother, inquiring of the Indians who had care of her, was informed that they were of the Delaware nation. At the distance of about 70 rods from the house, contrary to all their promises, they put to death Thomas Potter. And having proceeded on the mountain about 3 or 4 miles, one of the Indians sunk the spear of his tomahawk into the breast of the small child, and after repeated blows scalped it. After crossing the mountain they passed the house of Mr. Halbert T., and seeing him out, shot at him, but without effect. Thence, passing late in the evening McCord's old fort, they encamped about half a mile in the gap. The second day, having passed into the Path Valley, they discovered a party of white men in pursuit of them, on which they ordered the prisoners to hasten, for should the whites come up with them, they should all be tomahawked. Having been thus hurried, they reached the top of the Tuscarora mountain, and all had sat down to rest, when an Indian, without any previous warning, sunk a tomahawk into the forehead of Samuel Hunter, who was seated by my father, and by repeated blows put an end to his existence. He was then scalped, and the Indians, proceeding on their journey, encamped that evening some miles on the north of Sidling Hill. The next day they marched over the Allegheny Mountains through what is now called Blair's Gap. On the 5th day, whilst crossing Stony Creek, the wind blew a hat of my father's from the head of the Indian in whose custody he was. The Indian went down the stream some distance before he recovered it. In the meantime, my father had passed the creek, but when the Indian returned, he severely beat my father with the gun, and almost disabled him from traveling any further. And now, reflecting that he could not possibly travel much further, and that if this was the case he would be immediately put to death, he determined to attempt his escape that night. 2 days before this, the half of my father's head was painted red. This denoted that a council had been held, and that an equal number were for putting him to death and for keeping him alive, and that another council was to have taken place to determine the question. Being encamped, my parents, who before this had not liberty to speak to one another, were permitted to assist each other in plucking a turkey, and thus engaged, the design of escaping was communicated to my mother. After some of the Indians had laid down, and one of them was amusing the others with dressing himself with a gown of my mother's, my father was called to go for water. He took a quart, and emptying it of what water it contained, stepped about 6 rods down to the spring. My mother, perceiving this, succeeded so well in confining the attention of the Indians to the gown, that my father had got about 100 yards, when the Indians from one fire cried to those of another, "Your man is gone!" They ran after him, and one having brought back the quart, said, "Here is the quart, but no man." They spent 2 days in looking after him, while the prisoners were confined in the camp, but after an unsuccessful search they proceeded down the stream to the Allegheny River, thence to Fort Duquesne, now Fort Pitt. After remaining there 1 night and a day, they went about 20 miles down the Ohio to an Indian town, on entering which a squaw took a cap off my mother's head, and with many others severely beat her. Now almost exhausted with fatigue, she requested leave to remain at this place, but was told she might, if she preferred being scalped to proceeding. They then took her to a town called Kossuskee. On arriving at this place, Daniel McManamy was detained outside of the town, but my mother, the 2 boys and girls, were taken into the town, at the same time having their hair pulled, faces scratched, and beaten in an unmerciful manner. Here I shall extract from my father's papers the manner and circumstances of McManamy's death. This account appears to have been obtained from my mother shortly after her return, who received it from those who had been eyewitnesses of the tragical scene. The Indians formed themselves into a circle round the prisoner, and commenced by beating him, some with sticks and some with tomahawks. He was then tied to a post near a large fire, and after being tortured some time with burning coals, they scalped him and put the scalp on a pole to bleed before his face. A gun barrel was then heated red hot and passed over his body, and with a red hot bayonet they pierced his body with many repetitions. In this manner they continued torturing him, singing and shouting until he expired. Shortly after this, my mother set out from this place, leaving the 2 boys and girl, whom she never saw again, until they were liberated. She was now distressed beyond measure, going she knew not where without a comforter, without a companion, and expecting to share the fate of McManamy in the next town she would reach. In this distressed situation, she met a number of Indians, among whom was a captive woman. To her my mother made known her fears, on which she was informed that her life was not in danger, for that belt of wampum, said she, about your neck is a certain sign that you are intended for an adopted relation. They soon after arrived at a town, and being taken into the council house, 2 squaws entered in. One stepped up and struck my mother on the side of the head. Perceiving that the other was about to follow this example, she turned her head and received a second blow. The warriors were highly displeased, such acts in a council house being contrary to the usage. Here a chief took my mother by the hands, and delivered her to 2 Indian men, to be in place of a deceased sister. She was put in charge of a squaw in order to be cleanly clothed. She had remained here with her adopted friends near a month, when her party began to think of removing to the headwaters of the Susquehanna, a journey of about 200 miles. This was very painful to my mother, having already traveled above 200 miles over the mountains and swamps until her feet and legs were extremely swollen and sore. Fortunately, on the day of their setting out, a horse was given to her by her adopted brother, but before they had traveled far, one of the horses in the company died, and she was then obliged to surrender hers to supply its place. After proceeding on her journey some miles, they were met by a number of Indians, one of whom told her not to be discouraged, as a peace was about to take place shortly, when she would have leave to return home. To this information she was the more disposed to give credit, as it came from one who was a chief counselor in the Delaware nation, with whom she was a prisoner. Having arrived near the end of her journey, to her great surprise she saw a captive dead by the roadside, having been tomahawked and scalped. She was informed that he had endeavored to escape, but was overtaken at this place. On arriving at the place of destination, having in all traveled near 500 miles, the fatigue which she had undergone with cold and hunger brought on a severe fit of sickness, which lasted near 2 months. In this doleful situation, having no person to comfort or sympathize with her, a blanket was her only covering, and her bed was the cold earth in a miserable cabin. Boiled corn was her only food. She was reduced to so weak a state as to consider herself as approaching the verge of dissolution. But recovering from her sickness, she met with a woman with whom she had been formerly acquainted. This woman had been in captivity for some years, and had an Indian husband by whom she had one child. My mother reproved her for this, but received for answer that before she had consented, they had tied her to a stake in order to burn her. She added that as soon as their captive women could speak the Indian tongue, they were obliged to marry one of them, or be put to death. This information induced her to determine never to learn the Indian language, and she adhered to this determination all the time she remained with them, from the day of her captivity to that of her releasement, a space of 2 years and 5 months. She was treated during this time by her adopted relations with much kindness, even more than she had reason to expect. I shall now return to the narration of facts respecting my father, after he had made his escape from the Indians as before stated. The Indians, as soon as he was missed, gave chase. Finding himself closely pursued, he hid in a hollow log until they had gone by and out of hearing, when, turning in a different direction, he resumed his flight. 2 days, it has been said, were spent by the Indians in search of him. In the meantime, with much fatigue and suffering, he came to a mountain 4 miles across, and at the top covered with snow. By this time he was almost exhausted, having traveled nearly constantly for 2 days and nights, and being without food, except a few buds plucked from trees as he went along. His shoes were worn out, and the country he traveled through being extremely rough and in many places covered with briars of a poisonous nature, his feet were very much lacerated and swollen. To add to his difficulties, the mountain was overgrown with laurel, and the snow lodged upon its leaves so bent it down that he was unable in many places to get along in his weak condition, except by creeping upon his hands and knees under the branches. 3 days had now elapsed since his escape, and although he feared that the Indians were still in pursuit of him, and that by traveling along the mountain they would find his tracks in the snow, and by that means be led to his place of concealment, yet he found himself so lame that he could proceed no further. His hands also, by crawling upon them in the snow, became almost as much swollen as his feet. He was therefore compelled to lie by without much prospect indeed of ever proceeding any further on his journey. Besides the danger of being overtaken by his savage pursuers, he was in fact in a starving condition, not having tasted food since his escape, except the buds already mentioned, plucked as he journeyed on from the beanwood or redbud tree as it is called. On the 5th day, however, as he was creeping on his hands and knees, not being able yet to walk, in search of buds or herbs to appease his hunger, he was fortunate enough to see a rattlesnake, which he killed and ate raw. After lying by 3 or 4 days, he allayed the swelling of his feet by puncturing the festered parts with a thorn. He then tore up his breeches, and with the pieces bound up his feet as well as he could. Thus prepared, he again set out upon his journey, limping along with great pain. But he had no other alternative except to remain where he was and die. He had gone but a few miles, when from a hill he had just descended, he was startled by the welcome sound of a drum. He called as loud as he could, but there was no one to answer. It was but a delusion of the imagination. Sad and disappointed he journeyed on again, and on the 8th day crossed the Juniata by wading it, which on account of his lameness he accomplished with great difficulty. It was now night and very cold, and his clothes being wet, he was so benumbed that he was afraid to lie down lest he should perish. And he, therefore lame and wearied as he was, determined to pursue his journey, although it was very dark. Providential circumstance, for in the course of the night as he wandered on, he scarcely knew whither, he was attracted by the sight of a fire apparently abandoned the day before, probably by a party of the settlers who were out in pursuit of the Indians. Remaining here till morning, he discovered a path leading in the direction of the settlements, which he followed with as much speed as he was able. This was the 9th day since his escape, during which time a few buds and 4 snakes were all he had to subsist on. In the afternoon of this day he was alarmed by suddenly meeting at a turn of his path 3 Indians, but they proved friendly, and instead of killing him as he expected when he first saw them, they conducted him in a few hours to Fort Littleton, in Bedford County, a place well known to him where he remained a few days, until sufficiently recruited in strength to proceed home. Some time after my father's return home he went to Fort Pitt, which was then in the hands of the English, and a number of Indians being on the opposite side of the river about to form a treaty, he one evening went over to make inquiry concerning my mother. My father observed among them several who were present when he was taken prisoner. To these he discovered himself, but they professed not to know him, on which he inquired of them if they did not recollect having been at the taking of 9 persons, referring them to the time and place. They then acknowledged it, and inquired of him how he got home, etc., after which he made inquiry concerning my mother, but they said they knew nothing of her, but promised to give him some information by the time of his return the next day. He then returned to the fort. Shortly after this, a young man who had been taken by the Indians when a child followed him and advised him not to return, for that when he had left them he had heard them say that they had never had a stronger desire for anything than to have sunk the tomahawk into his head, and that they had agreed to kill him on his return the next day. After this man had requested my father not to mention anything of him having been with him, or of the subject of their conversation, he returned to camp. I may here state that from the time that my father was taken by the Indians until my mother was released, he did little else than wander from place to place in quest of information respecting her, and after he was informed where she was, his whole mind bent upon contriving plans for her redemption. Desiring with this view to again go to Pittsburgh, he fell in with a brigade of wagons commanded by Mr. Irvine. With them he proceeded as far as Bedford, but finding this a tedious way of traveling, he spoke to the commanding officer of the place to get Captain Whiteyes, who commanded a party of Indians to promise to accompany him to Pittsburgh. This was accordingly done, and the Indians having agreed to take him safe to Pitt, my father set out with them, having a horse and a new rifle. They had proceeded but about 2 miles when an Indian turned off the road and took up a scalp which that morning had been taken off one of the wagoners. This alarmed my father not a little, but having proceeded about 10 miles further, the Indians again turned off the road, and brought several horses and a keg of whiskey which had been concealed. Shortly after this, the Indians began to drink so as to become intoxicated. Whiteyes then signified to my father that as he had ran off from them, he would then shoot him, and raised his gun to take aim. But my father, stepping behind a tree, ran around it while the Indian followed. This for a time gave great amusement to the bystanders, until a young Indian stepped up, twisted the gun out of the hands of Whiteyes, and hid it under a log. The Indians became considerably intoxicated and scattered, leaving Whiteyes with my father. Whiteyes then made at him with a large stick, aiming at his head, but my father threw up his arm and received so severe a blow as to blacken it for weeks. At this time an Indian of another nation, who had been sent as an express to Bedford, came by. Captain Whiteyes applied to him for his gun to shoot my father, but the Indian refused, as they were about making peace, and the killing of my father would bring on another war. Being of different nations, they were obliged to speak in English. By this time my father, finding himself in a desperate situation, resolved at all events to attempt an escape. He said to Captain Whiteyes, "Our horses are going away," and went towards them, expecting every minute to receive a ball in his back. But on coming up to his horse, he got on him and took to the road. He had gone but a short distance when he saw the Indian who had taken the gun out of Whiteyes' hand sleeping at a spring, and I have often heard him say, had it been any of the other Indians, he would have shot him. Fearing pursuit, he rode as fast as his horse could go, and having traveled all night, he got to Pittsburgh the next morning shortly after sunrise, and he was not there more than 3 hours until the Indians were in after him. But from a fear of injury being done to my mother should he kill them, he suppressed his anger and passed the matter by. Here he had an opportunity of writing her a letter, requesting her to inform her adopted friends that if they would bring her in, he would pay them £40. But having waited for an answer until he became impatient, he bargained with an Indian to go and steal her away. But the night before he was to start, he declined going, saying that he would be killed if he went. In this situation, he resolved at all hazards to go himself and bring her, for which purpose he set out and went to a place on the Susquehanna. I think it was called Shamokin, not far from what is called the Big Cherry Trees. From here he set out on an Indian path, along which he had traveled until evening, when he was met by a party of Indians who were bringing in my mother. The Indians passed him by and raised the war halloo. My mother felt distressed at their situation, and my father, perceiving the Indians not to be in a good humor, began to promise them their pay, as he had promised by letter, when they would come to Shamokin. But the Indians told him that if he got them among the whites, he would then refuse to pay them, and that they would then have no redress. Finding they were thus apprehensive, he told them to keep him as a hostage out in the woods, and send his wife into town, and he would then send an order for the money to be paid them, and that if it was not done, they might do with him as they pleased. This had the desired effect. They got quite good-humored and brought them in, on doing which the money was paid agreeably to promise. Before my father and mother left Shamokin, he requested an Indian who had been an adopted brother of my mother, if he ever came down amongst the white people, to call and see him. Accordingly, some time afterwards the Indian paid him a visit, he living then about 10 miles from Chambersburg. The Indian, having continued for some time with him, went to a tavern, known by the name of McCormick's, and there became somewhat intoxicated when a certain Nugent, since executed in Carlisle for stealing horses, having a large knife in his hand, struck it into the Indian's neck, edge foremost, designing thereby to thrust it in between the bone and throat, and by drawing it forward to cut his throat. But he partly missed his aim, and only cut the forepart of the windpipe. On this, Nugent had to escape from justice, otherwise the law would have been put in force against him, and it has been remarked that ever after he continued to progress in vice until his death. A physician was brought to attend the Indian, the wound was sewed up, and he continued at my father's until he had recovered, when he returned to his own people, who put him to death on the pretext of his having, as they said, joined the white people. In August 1764, according to the best accounts of the time, my father and his family, from fear of the Indians, having moved to my grandfather Thomas Poe's about 3 miles from his own place, he took a black girl with him to his own place to make some hay. And being there at his work, a dog which he had with him began to bark, and run towards and from a thicket of bushes. Observing these circumstances, he became alarmed, and taking up his gun, told the girl to run to the house, for he believed that there were Indians near. So they made towards the house, and had not been there more than an hour, when from the loft of the house they saw a party, commanded by Captain Potter, late General Potter, in pursuit of a party of Indians, who had that morning murdered a schoolmaster of the name of Brown, with 10 small children, and scalped and left for dead one by the name of Archibald McCullough, who recovered and was living not long since. It was remarkable that with but few exceptions the scholars were much averse to going to school that morning, and the account given by McCullough is that when the master and scholars met at the school, 2 of the scholars informed him that on their way they had seen Indians, but the information was not attended to by the master, who ordered them to their books. Soon afterwards 2 old Indians and a boy rushed up to the door. The master, seeing them, prayed them only to take his life and spare the children, but unfeelingly the 2 old Indians stood at the door whilst the boy entered the house, and with a piece of wood made in the form of an Indian maul, killed the master and scholars, after which the whole of them were scalped. So that's it for this story from Incidents of Border Life by Jospeh Pritts. I hope to find a longer account of the Schoolhouse Massacre that we heard about at the end of this story, but this might be the only account that exists. We have also done a couple of videos on another schoolhouse massacre by Comanches in Hamilton, Texas that occurred in 1867. You can find a link to both of these videos in the description. The Bard family has also been called Baird or Beard, and there is a 1908 book by G.O. Sailhamer titled The Bard Family. This book is freely available online if you would like to learn more about the history of this family. Mrs. Bard's name was Catherine Poe Bard, and the Bards had only been married since December of 1756, and they had only one child, John Bard, when they were captured in 1758. And that child was the one that was so mercilessly killed by the Indians in this story. Richard and Catherine Bard had about 10 children following their captivity. Richard Bard's brother, William Bard, was the founder and namesake of Bardstown, Kentucky. Their father was born in Antrim in Northern Ireland, and the family was of Scots-Irish descent. I will now read a few sections of this book, The Bard Family, that tell about some of the events that occurred after the Bards returned. Captain White Eyes was of the Turtle tribe of the Delawares, and was placed at the head of his nation. During the early years of the Revolution, he was the consistent friend of the Americans. In this, he was opposed by his rival, Captain Pipe, who was of the Wolf tribe. Pipe was eager to take up the hatchet on the western frontier of Pennsylvania, but White Eyes successfully thwarted his designs until 1778, when the friendly chief accompanied General McIntosh's army to Tuscarorawas, and taking the smallpox died. After that, Captain Pipe's policy had ascendancy over the Delawares, except that with the Moravian Indians. Upon his death, Pipe declared that the Great Spirit had probably put White Eyes out of the way, that his nation might be saved. In the end, the contrary of this proved to be true. After many years of bitter and often successful warfare against the whites, the Delawares were almost completely annihilated by Mad Anthony Wayne. The remnant afterward shared in the overthrow of the Prophet by General Harrison at Tippecanoe. In 1818, the Delawares ceded all their land in the state of Indiana to the United States, and went west to the Mississippi. Later they became incorporated with the Cherokee Nation in Texas and the Indian Country. In 1903, a great-grandson of White Eyes was in Washington with a delegation of the Delawares that was seeking compensation for infraction of their rights in Cherokee lands, where he secured the friendly interest of Senator Bard of California, great-grandson of Richard Bard. An interesting relic of Mrs. Bard's captivity is still in existence. It is a great horn spoon made for her use by one of her Indian brothers, and used by her during her stay with the Delawares. When Mrs. Bard died, this spoon came into the possession of her youngest daughter, Martha, from whom it descended as an heirloom to her daughter, Catherine Wilson, and from Catherine Wilson to her daughter, Rachel McMean. It is now in the possession of Miss McMean, who lives at Blue Ash, Ohio. This interesting relic was made of black horn with a handle elaborately carved at the top. During the Revolution, Mr. Bard served in Captain Joseph Culbertson's marching company under the call of July 28, 1777, in the campaign around Philadelphia, and afterward in the ranging company of Captain Walter McKinney on the western frontier. Captain Culbertson's company marched with Colonel Arthur Buchanan's battalion of the 5th class, Cumberland County Militia. No particulars have been obtained of Mr. Bard's service on the frontier. His enrollment was with the company of Captain William Smith. Richard Bard never held any political office except that of Justice of the Peace for Peters Township, at the time when the justices were judges of the county courts. His commission was dated March 15, 1786. He was, however, a member of the Pennsylvania Convention of 1787, to which the Constitution framed by the Federal Convention was submitted. He was an anti-federalist, and refused to sign the ratification. Subsequently, he was a delegate to the Harrisburg Convention of 1788, in opposition to the federal Constitution. Mr. Bard's colleague in the Convention of 1787 was Colonel John Allison, who was an ardent Federalist, and seconded the motion to ratify made by Thomas McKean. His opposition to the federal Constitution before and after its ratification had a disastrous effect upon Mr. Bard's political fortunes. He was sometimes virulently assailed in the Franklin Repository, the Federalist organ in the county, during the next 10 years. Like many of the early settlers on the Pennsylvania frontier, Richard Bard, soon after the close of the French and Indian War, acquired extensive tracts of land as far westward as the western side of the Alleghenies. The Bard family of Bardstown, Kentucky had a tradition that during the Revolutionary period, Richard Bard went to Danville with his brother William, where he built a cabin that entitled him to 1,000 acres of land, but afterward he returned to Pennsylvania. Mr. Bard died intestate and was buried in the Presbyterian graveyard at Church Hill. So that's it for this episode about the difficulties faced by the Bard family during the French and Indian War and through the Revolutionary period. We will continue to cover more incidents of border life during this time on this channel. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is now viewed as unworthy to show on history channels on TV. But here on this channel, we keep this worthy history alive by telling the stories of people who lived difficult lives long ago, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support our efforts to keep actual history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Your $5 pledge each month will allow you to access our members-only videos, and you will also be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.